Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Brian Kelly, LSU kicking off fall camp. And Dill, this is one of those programs where you're fired up for fall camp to kick off. You have so many different storylines for this LSU program heading into 2024. I think it starts on the defensive side of the football where you're bringing Blake Baker. You have a ton of young talent on this LSU defense. What do we see from this unit during fall camp? Going to get into a little bit of that. And then on the offensive side of the football, you have to replace the Heisman Trophy winning quarterback in Jaden Daniels. A lot of question marks for this LSU program. But I think what not enough people are talking about, there's a lot of answers on this LSU team as well. Fired up to get into it. Before we do it, as always, just want to say thank you to you guys. And it's been a long off season talking this LSU program. Dill, we've taken a look at this depth chart. Just about every single angle you could possibly take a look at it. The LSU fans who've been rocking with the boys all off season, can't thank you guys enough. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And I think much more importantly, your biggest storylines, the breakout players you guys are looking for. This is what we are going to talk about over the next couple of weeks for this LSU team. And Dill, without further ado, I think you got to start on the defense side of the football. I look at this LSU program specifically on offense and say, yeah, you have to replace really good quarterback, some really good wide receivers. I think this LSU offense is going to be one of the better units, not only in the SEC, but in the country. I think on this LSU defense, this is where this program becomes as dangerous as they can be. And I think I want to start with personnel usage. I mean, we kind of said this last year. The LSU defense from a talent standpoint was not very far off. You look at the LSU defense, yes, they had to deal with a lot of different injuries. We're playing with some young talent last year. The best way you can get better quickly is just knowing how to use your personnel a little bit better. We say this all the time. What's the sign of a really, really good defensive coordinator, just a football coach in general, knowing how to use your personnel? We thought last year was a disaster for LSU in terms of using their personnel. This year it's going to look a lot different. Let's start on the defensive side of the football. Let's start with Harold Perkins. Dill, you make no mistake about it. This is one of the best players on the defensive side of the football we see in the whole entire country. Blake Baker has worked magic with off-ball linebackers who can get it done in the pass rush department. If there's one thing that I think LSU takes a map with in 2024, it's using Harold Perkins to just have a bigger impact on the football game during the 2024 year.
And that's kind of just an easy answer to get a lot more production, I think. And you look at the way Blake Baker used Tyron Hopper last year, that's almost how you want, I think, Harold Perkins to look every game. And I do think there was a level where Perkins started to get that way towards the end of the year, and whether that was him figuring out, whether that was the defensive staff figuring out what to do with him, you did start to see that production ramp up for sure. But I think you just got to see it more often. You got to see it all year, and it's got to be consistent. And again, we look at the way Blake Baker's used guys like Tyron Hopper, very similar skill set to what Harold Perkins has, super explosive, really good in the pass rush, but also can just play straight up linebacker at the same time. So he's got the versatility. He's got a unique set of skills. I just want to see Harold Perkins' imprint on the game.
What I'm most excited for is during Harold Perkins' freshman year, that premier season we saw from him, it seemed like he was just playing football. It seemed like in year two with the position change, and I think the LSU staff just not sure how to use Harold Perkins, there was a lot more thinking for Harold Perkins. If you're Blake Baker, I don't really care how you use him. Can you get Harold Perkins just playing football, playing fast, flying around the football field? Because that's where he's at its best. Again, I don't care if he's dropping back in zone coverage. I don't care if he's coming off the edge or spying the quarterback. Let him be Harold Perkins. Let him go play fast. That's what I'm looking for from Harold Perkins in the 2024 season. Dill, I'll kind of give you the T-box. There's a lot of talent on this LSU defense. What's another name that I think you're just interested in terms of how they decide to use this personnel in 2024?
So to me, I'm kind of looking at this cornerback room in general, and I think that was one issue last year where they just never got a rotation. It felt like they were more comfortable with who was going to do it. You saw Sage Ryan at times. You saw Ashton Stamps. You saw a whole variety of guys, it felt like, and they never quite got just a a set of two that they felt really comfortable with. I'm looking, can they figure that out quickly? And I think the obvious candidate is Ashton Stamps. I actually think from a talent standpoint, he has almost exactly what you want. Really smooth mover for being a tall, lengthy cornerback. I think can do a little bit of a better job in that kind of press man system that Blake Baker likes to run a lot. You saw what he was doing with those corners at Mizzou. I think that's a little bit more conducive than that like soft zone that LSU was kind of running last year. And then another one I think is just stepping up to the plate and making it happen is PJ Woodland. And we saw a little bit of that in the spring. He does have that, like, kind of those traits in that feel of just an elite man cover corner. Not the biggest guy in the world, but sticky as you want. And I think he is going to be a key to getting guys like Ryan Sage, Major Burns, Jordan Gilbert, those type of guys in better positions to have a better year, because Ryan Sage really should never been a quarter.
You talk about Sage Ryan. I think Sage Ryan's one of the more fascinating prospects, or not prospects, but players in this LSU secondary where you can do a lot of different things with him. I think he can be a pretty quality football player. It did seem like he was kind of playing out of position as well. And I think that had a lot to do with just the injuries that LSU had to deal with in the secondary. I look at the personnel from the secondary, especially with Zy Alexander working his way back. J.K. Johnson, I've been a massive fan of since his days at Ohio State. I think the personnel's there. Now, can you put the secondary on the football field? Can they all come together as a unit to be a solid group? That's probably the question you want to see iron itself out in fall camp.
Because even if you can nail that safety spot down, Major Burns, when he's playing around the line of scrimmage, that's, I think, where you see him at his best. Physical guy, does a really good job sniffing out runs and getting downhill and making plays. So again, I think you kind of look, to me, it starts with those corners. If they can get a solid, steady rotation from Woodland and Stamps, which does frankly feel like what it's going to be at this point, I think you're well on your way to kind of getting a secondary that you just feel good about, and you don't need to change positions and roll it as much as they were last year.
Yeah, it's a similar conversation like we had with a lot of offensive line units last year. When you were consistently mixing and matching and it's a new face every single Saturday, it's hard to get consistent play out of that unit. I think just being a little bit healthier, being a little bit more experienced, going to bring out a little bit better of a secondary deal. I think the next thing I want to move to is young talent standing out on defense. Now, you kind of talked about some of the young talent in the secondary. I kind of am focusing on the defensive line. I think the first one we got to talk about is true freshman Dominic McKinley. You make no mistake about it. Where's the biggest question mark from a personnel standpoint on this LSU defense? It's on the inside of the defensive line. You have some guys that you feel pretty good about. Can you have a game record? That's kind of what you're looking for. Look, Dominic McKinley is a guy that I think in most years you'd want to give him not necessarily a redshirt year, but not lean on him as much as you might have to. That being said, you talk about one of the keys for LSU to take that massive step on defense. It probably has to do with Dominic McKinley on the inside of the LSU defense. Sean Washington's another guy, kind of the body type that LSU's looking for. I think that was a sneaky addition in the transfer portal, a kid that started at Georgia, went JUCO, now back at the SEC. That's the body type you're looking for. And at the edge, I mean, you got to look at a guy like Deshaun Womack. I think you have a guy with Braden Swinson. You look at Savion Jones. Again, going into year 4, haven't seen him quite put it together. Talented prospect coming out of high school. I think we both have our eyes on Deshaun Womack. Going into year 2, that's normally when you see these line of scrimmage players kind of take that jump. Can Deshaun Womack do that in 2024? I think massive storyline for LSU on defense.
And that'll be a thing, like, you kind of feel out. I just think the physicality needs to come way up, because you see the athleticism, you see the length, some of those like instincts as a pass rusher, but just really not near where he needed to be, I think, from a physical standpoint. One other guy I'll point out, frankly, is Gabriel Relaford. I thought he had a dominant game in that spring game against obviously a very good offensive line, a group offensive lineman, deep, good for LSU. I think he's important mainly because I think they want to have some freedom to move Paris Shand around, who's a guy I think can be super versatile, really good size at that defensive end spot. And frankly, I think he's a guy I look at can almost help them create some depth in that interior, because I do think he has some flexibility depending on the team, depending on the down and distance, to go inside and make it happen. So again, you kind of look, well, how are we going to address that depth issue that we have on the inside? I think if Gabriel Relaford can give him good snaps at the edge, I think that allows them to use Parrish in some creative ways and get him rolling.
And I would throw in Savion Jones into that conversation as well. I mean, Savion Jones up to what, 285 pounds. That's a guy that could kick into the 3-tech, no doubt about it. There are different ways in terms of addressing certain positions that might lack depth. I think LSU has some avenues, whether it's players stepping up like Dominic McKinley or whether it's kind of kicking Savion Jones or Parrish in down to the inside. There are ways for LSU to circumvent some of the question marks they have on the inside of the defensive line. Going to number 3 storyline, I think kind of a fascinating storyline from 2 different standpoints. One, Dill, you have to replace Jaden Daniels at the quarterback spot. That means you have to replace a lot of rushing production as well. I think more importantly, and we got to get the running back room kind of on our screen here. That'd be a good start for the boys. You have Joshua Williams, been with the program a long time. Dill, I think we both have our eyes on 2 different guys, right? Caleb Jackson going into his second year. I think the most gifted running back in this room, but I'm also kind of having an eye on Caden Durham. You look at Caleb Jackson, not only does he have some serious burners, but he's a big bruising running back. Then you look at someone like Caden Durham. He's going to be the fastest running back in the country, clocking in a, 10.29 in the 100-meter dash. There's not many players purely in college football that are as fast as Caden Durham. I think Jelani Watkins for LSU is probably the only other guy faster than him. Caden Durham has speed that's going to allow him to get on the football field. I trust Joe Sloan to get him involved in unique ways. I look at the running back room and say, I'm just kind of curious to see, one, how it shakes out, but more importantly, how these different running backs are getting used in this LSU offense to stimulate a rushing attack that's going to have to look a little bit different without having Jaden Daniels taking the snaps at quarterback.
Well, one reason I think Caden Durham is going to be a factor is you kind of look at the other 3. They're sort of inside guys. I mean,
yes,
Caleb Jackson, big physical runner. Same with Emory and Josh Williams. Those guys, more what you've seen them when you've seen them at their best, it's been in between the tackles. And you kind of think, in trying to think of how this rushing attack is going to look, that is kind of where they rushed their running backs last year. But again, you saw the way Daniels was able to work the edges and the perimeters in their rushing attack. I think obviously the running backs are going to have to work some of that themselves, whether that's through pitches, swing passes, those type of things. And I think that's where you kind of look to Caden Durham to make it happen, because I don't know that those other guys – and again, Caleb Jackson I think can very much be an all-around guy.
Yep.
But I do think Caden Durham can give him something in terms of adding a perimeter run that you're just going to lose when you lose a guy in Jaden Daniels, who was so good in that impaired.
And you go back to what makes Joe Sloan one of the better OCs that you see in the country, knows how to use these type of guys. Going into storyline number 4, okay, I'll just say this. I mean, Jaden Daniels was a phenomenal quarterback for LSU. There's no arguing that. I have a lot of confidence in Garrett Nussmeier to come and take over the offense and, I mean, still be one of the better quarterbacks in the SEC. I wouldn't be surprised that you fast forward to the end of November. That's where Garrett Nussmeier kind of comes in with that conversation. I think a bigger storyline for LSU is the pass catcher room. A lot of people look on the surface and say, all right, you lose guys like Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas, it's going to take a step back. I'm not necessarily saying it's not going to take at least a small step back. Those were, I mean, Malik Neighbors, in my mind, generational kind of wide receiver. That being said, this LSU wide receiver room, the pass catcher room in general, at least in my mind, is still one of the better units that you'll see in the entire country. A guy that just seems to, at least in my mind, fly under the radar, Chris Hilton Jr., Kyron Lacey, they get a lot of buzz. Dill, CJ Daniels, I mean, kind of lined up in the 2 deep right now. I don't think he's going to be in the 2 deep for very long. I think one of the question marks is, how do you get CJ Daniels, Chris Hilton Jr., Kyron Lacey all on the field at the same time? Because those are 3 of the better wide receivers, not in the SEC, but in the country. How does this wide receiver room shake out? One of the things that I'm going to be looking at during fall camp.
And you kind of look at that because you don't really want to take your tight end off the field. Mason James, he's so good for them, so effective running routes and blocking, just all around one of the better tight ends in college football. So that is where I think it gets interesting, how much rotating they do, how they use different personnel for different plays. That'll certainly be something. And again, like early in the season in that USC game, kind of getting a sense of what they're going to do with that group, because you're almost right. Like, there are a lot of mouths to feed, and I do wonder how they're going to kind of keep everyone happy, engaged, all that.
And I'll trust Joe Sloan once again. And another guy that, again, I look at Xavier Thomas and Aaron Anderson and say what they can do with the football in their hands, especially when you have some boundary wide receivers that are so good working vertically down the field. those are also other two guys that you want to get involved in this LSU offense. Make no mistake about it, it's a good problem to have, like just trying to figure out how to use all of this offensive talent. But it is a talking point that I think should be prevalent within this LSU program is, hey, how do we maximize the amount of offensive talent that we have on the football field? Because I think you make a good point. There are a lot of other offenses that have loaded wide receiver rooms, probably not so great tight end rooms, where you're probably going to play some 4 wide receiver sets. You look at Mason Taylor and say, that's not a guy that we want to kind of have off the field. So you got to try to make it work with 3 wide receivers. What do those rotations look like? How are these wide receivers involved in the offense? That's some of the questions that you have for LSU. Again, good problem to have for LSU on the offensive side of the football, and Dill, a fascinating LSU team heading into fall camp. We'll cut it there. Again, appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.